Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to Saturday of the Net Impact Conference. My name is Liz Ma, for those who don't know me yet. Thank you very much. Net Impact's mission is to mobilize next-gen leaders to change the world, and I can't think of a more passionate and committed next-gen leader than Chelsea Clinton. Chelsea wrote her first letter to the president when she was 5. She wrote Ronald Reagan and asked him not to visit a Nazi cemetery in Germany. Her letter said, "Dear Mr. President, I've seen The Sound of Music. The Nazis don't look like very nice people. Please don't visit their cemetery," complete with a heart rainbow sticker at the bottom. When Chelsea was 6, her dad was running for governor of Arkansas, and she and her mom and dad would practice mock debates where Chelsea would have to play his opponent as well as himself. And having had the opportunity to meet her dad a couple times and witness how fast his mind works, I think that sounds terrifying. Chelsea also learned to read by reading the newspaper, a practice that she continues today by reading newspaper headlines to her baby daughter. Chelsea grew up in the public eye and is committed to driving transformational change today through her role as vice chair at the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation. She is also, in her free time, just managed to write a great book for young people called It's Your World. Please welcome Chelsea Clinton to the stage.
Thank you, Liz, for that warm and slightly embarrassing introduction. I did indeed write that letter to President Reagan when I was 5, and yes, I did include a whole sheet of rainbow and heart stickers with the letter as a gesture of goodwill. I actually never got a response. Oh, I know. And even more disappointingly, President Reagan still went to Bitburg Cemetery. I know, yes. Wow, you're such an interactive audience. But at least I had tried. And we have a saying in my family that it's always better to get caught trying. And I know that that ethos is probably pretty widely shared here this morning. It's always better to get caught trying to make a difference than to never try at all. And I'm looking forward to my conversation with Liz, but before we begin, I just want to talk a bit about our partnership with Net Impact and then a little bit about the Clinton Foundation. We at the Clinton Global Initiative University, or what we refer to as CGIU, have had, I think, a really exciting and really fun partnership with Net Impact and the Pete Peterson Foundation over the last few years, running a nationwide competition on college and university campuses, asking groups of young people to help raise awareness about the challenge of the national debt. That sounds pretty serious and onerous, so it's clearly a particular kind of charge and challenge for the teams that take up this competition. But what we've seen over the last few years has just been amazing. I mean, the innovative ways that teams have used not only debt clocks, but also debt donuts, has clearly been pretty remarkable and sometimes pretty delicious. And we just have had such a good time helping to raise awareness about a challenge that is too underappreciated at the national level, but certainly historically at the community and university levels. CGIU, as I know some of you know, because I know we have some CGIU members in the audience today, is our effort at the Clinton Foundation to bring together young change makers who are already engaged in the business of making a difference, either on their college campuses or across our country or even around the world, to help them network together, to help them learn together around everything from how to write a real business plan to how to appropriately and not to use social media, how to think about partnerships, how to think about maybe even getting acquired, how to think about whether or not the program they've started would be best sustained on their campus by someone else or best sustained by themselves as a job and a social enterprise after they leave college or university. So I hope that some of you who may not know about CGIU or hadn't had the chance to join us before will apply. The deadline is December 1st. It's at UC Berkeley this year. That hurts my Stanford heart. Oh, I know. Thank you for the sympathy. But I'm really looking forward to the meeting in the spring, and I hope to see some of you there. My father started the Clinton Foundation in 2002 to solve a very particular challenge in the world. By 2002, almost everyone in the developed world, so including the United States, who needed HIV/AIDS medicines were receiving them. Not everyone, but almost everyone. In sub-Saharan Africa, fewer than 200,000 people were receiving HIV/AIDS medicines, even though the needs were already in the tens of millions. And it largely was a cost and distribution challenge. It was a cost challenge because at that point, the average price of ARV regimen for an adult per year was about $10,000 at a time when the average per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa was well below $1,000 per year. And it was a distribution challenge because there weren't sort of the logistical infrastructure available to even ensure that the drugs would get to the people who needed them. And so my father started the Clinton Foundation to turn the ARV, the antiretroviral drug market, from a high-price, low-volume dynamic to a high-volume, low-price dynamic, and to set up distribution channels to ensure that the drugs could get to where they were most needed. And I'm really proud, I'm deeply biased towards my parents, but I'm really proud to say that now the average price per person per year for first-line antiretrovirals in the developing world is less than $100 per person. And that is something that shows, to me, when we focus on the how do we solve a problem and who do we need around the table and kind of what are we going to accomplish together, but focusing on the how can be truly disruptive, innovative, and impacting. That model has set the tone for what the foundation still does today, whether in global health around the world, where we increasingly do less and less in HIV/AIDS because our government partners are able to do that work themselves. We do more in areas like childhood diarrhea, which I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer if it comes up, because I'm obsessed with diarrhea. We work in tuberculosis and malaria. We do a lot of work with smallholder farmers now in sub-Saharan Africa, helping to build farming cooperatives so that smallholder farmers have really amplified purchasing power when they're buying seeds and fertilizers, and also have the technical knowledge that really revolutionized farming in this country in the 20th century. We do a lot of work around issues related to girls and women here in the US and around the world, really trying to ensure that at least we understand what the challenges are, kind of what are common and what are really unique and idiosyncratic country to country, and what's really been working and why, so that we know better what to advocate for, what to push for, and hopefully what to finally achieve. So this is just a little bit about what we do. I'm so thrilled, as always, to be in a community of change makers. I have had such a kind of fun time getting to know Liz and the Up to Us competition team through our partnership with CGIU, and I'm looking forward to our conversation this morning. So thank you all for welcoming me, and thank you, Liz, for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for being here. We really appreciate your opening remarks as well. I want to start with just learning a little bit more about your career path. You're what we call it in Impact, a tri-sector athlete. You've had positions in the private sector, in the social sector, and obviously you know a lot about government. So, and I remember that you wanted to be a doctor when you were in college as well. So talk us a little bit through how you've decided to focus where you focused.
Well, I was always interested in questions relating to healthcare, and I think initially I wanted to be a doctor because I didn't realize that there were other ways to engage in improving public health. So that actually shifted for me pretty quickly once I understood that medical care, not only doctors, but nurses, technicians, community health workers, midwives, exist in a system, not only in this country, but around the world. And the contours and dynamics of that system vary community to community and country to country. I made a clear decision, actually, when I finished my master's degree, that I wanted to go and work in the private sector because I had no inherited knowledge of the private sector. My parents had been involved in government or predominantly NGO work, even when my mom was a lawyer in Arkansas in the 1980s and early 1990s. What we talked most about around the breakfast table and the dinner table was the work that she was doing as a pro bono counsel, or the work that she was doing on behalf of women and children, public education in Arkansas. And so I very much felt like I had an inherited understanding of what motivated my parents to engage in kind of their call to change the world through government and through the NGO sector, but I didn't really know kind of what the private sector was in any kind of intimate sense. And so I made a decision that I wanted to acquire a different set of skills and a different kind of understanding of what kind of the mentality in the corporate sector was, how companies thought about making money, kind of what a balance sheet was, what a cash flow statement was, what an income statement was. And I'm so grateful that I did, because I learned a tremendous amount in my years, both at McKinsey and then in my years working on Wall Street. And then I decided I really wanted to apply what I had learned to the questions that had always been consuming both my mind and my heart, really around public health, the empowerment of women. So I went back and I got my doctorate in international relations with a focus on global health, and also started working with the foundation. So that's sort of the abridged version, I guess, of the last 15 years of my life.
And you are vice chair at the foundation. What exactly does that mean you focus on?
Well, it means I focus on everything, although certainly I do have particular areas of passion. So it means I focus on everything from kind of the vision and the strategy of the foundation to the financial health of the foundation to what our HR policies are, something I certainly have a different feeling about now that I'm a working mom. And yet there are, of course, programs that I feel most connected to. Everything that we do related to health, not only globally, but here in the United States. The Clinton Foundation, in partnership with the American Heart Association, has an initiative called the Alliance for Healthier Generation, which is now the largest school-based childhood obesity prevention program in the country. And so I do a lot of work with the Alliance because I care intensely about childhood obesity and think, candidly, that's something that should be on all of our horizons, whether we care about social justice or women's rights or the quality of education or even national security or our economy. I think people have to care about childhood obesity. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have said in 2013 that if childhood obesity rates continued, within a decade we wouldn't be able to fully staff our military. There have been years where the Marines have been unable to recruit a sufficient number of men and women because people couldn't pass the physical fitness test. The same has happened to the New York City Fire Department. We now have children as young as 6 in our country suffering from chronic heart disease and acquiring type 2 or adult onset diabetes that sadly is no longer confined only to the adult population. So I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about, well, how can we use schools as a disruptive mechanism to not only change what kids are eating and how they're thinking about their health, but also getting exercise and understanding in a real kind of health literacy sense, what choices should they be making today and what choices should they be making in the future, and how do they help their families support them in those healthy choices. And I spent a lot of time on our No Ceilings work, which is our efforts around girls and women. I didn't know that I could care any more about the rights and opportunities for girls and women until I became a mother and had a daughter. And somehow I just do care more intensely about the world that Charlotte, my 13-month-old daughter, is going to grow up in, and whether or not she'll have the same opportunities that the little boys that she'll know growing up will have. So that's kind of a mix of how I think about both the macro picture, as well as some of the initiatives that I feel really connected to and do a lot of kind of day-to-day work with.
That's such a rich portfolio of programs. How do you all decide where you're going to focus within the Clinton Foundation?
Well, we think about, do we think there's a real need? Do we think then that we are best suited to meet that need? And sometimes that answer is yes, and sometimes that answer is no. So for example, we got engaged in the smallholder agriculture work because we had deep and productive relationships with our partner governments and many of our partner kind of NGOs and even private sector company partners in the developing world, countries where we work. Because we believe, in the best sense, NGOs like the Clinton Foundation are there to fill the gap between what the public sector can currently provide at an affordable cost to itself, or where there's a sufficiently robust business case for the private sector to produce at a reasonable profit for itself. And certainly, even though the Clinton Foundation works in partnership and hires a majority of local staff for our programs, we're still not kind of born in and of the countries where we work outside the United States, and so we always try to have an exit plan. I think it's important that there's always sort of an exit strategy kind of when you begin, particularly in development work, so that you don't fall into kind of a pattern of inertia. But we got involved in smallholder agriculture work because we realized how similar it was to some of the disruptive systems work that we were doing in health. So we thought we were disproportionately kind of skilled and prepared to make a positive difference in the kind of economic and then social lives of the smallholder farmers that we would work with than any other entity. But for example, we're often asked to work in education. We have no experience in education. We now know a lot about kind of health and wellness in this country through the public education system. And so we say we could help you think about how you do this in your own country, if that would be useful. But we know nothing about how to think about improving access or quality education around the world. So we try to be very judicious about saying, here's where we think we could make a difference. Here's where we don't believe that we can make a difference. But here are other organizations that we've worked alongside who you may want to talk to if you're trying to solve X, Y, and Z problem. Just because we can't help you solve it doesn't mean there aren't others who really could.
And how do you evaluate your programs? Do you use your own staff or third-party evaluators?
All of the above. We are big believers in metrics, not only on the impact side, which is sometimes really hard to do, but also on the cost side, so that we're good stewards of our impact, so that we're able to make the maximum impact, hopefully as cost-effective as possible, because I think that then makes it more persuasive again to either the public sector or the private sector that there's a durability and sustainability that would be attractive to them in the future. So we, for example, thinking about the Alliance for Healthier Generation, we track all of the work that we're doing in schools in terms of kind of what food is being purchased, who's participating in our purchasing cooperatives, how many more kids are physically active than not, where have the deviations been from the baselines before or since we engaged. But we also, of course, look at overall obesity levels in the school districts where we work. We look at, for the school districts who track this, self-reported mental health and happiness of the students. We cross-evaluate that with the family-based data that exists either in the school districts or in data sets that are easily correlated, whether from Medicaid or other kind of publicly available data sets. But we also open all of our data to the CDC, for example, both because we think it's important that we're participating in the big macro studies that the Centers for Disease Control are doing around childhood obesity, but also so that they can tell us, we think you're actually doing a great job, I'm now making this up, but in Southern Florida, but we think you maybe could be doing better in Philadelphia. And we work with RTI and other third-party evaluators. So we rigorously track ourselves. We also open source our data when we think that is really important from a public health or kind of other imperative. And then we always have third-party evaluators, generally academic partners or kind of people whose business that is, who have real credibility like RTI.
And can you share an example of something that didn't work as well?
Sure. I mean, a really painful example is now more than a decade ago when the Clinton Foundation had really started to crack the nut on both the kind of cost of the inputs for the generic drug companies who were manufacturing the ARVs largely in India, Brazil, and South Africa, but also had helped kind of the governments who were buying those drugs from the developing world kind of band together so they had more purchasing heft. Some of the governments helped us to start, asked us to help them on pediatric AIDS drugs and also on preventing mother-to-child transmission, which requires slightly different interventions. And we started to do that work, but we hadn't projected sufficiently forward. Well, if a child is born HIV negative, what then needs to happen to ensure that child stays HIV negative? Now, there's kind of some contestation about this, but certainly at the time, the prevailing science and public health knowledge was that a child shouldn't be breastfed because breast milk can still be a carrier mechanism for the HIV virus. And we hadn't thought about how, well, this is not just a drugs challenge, this is also a behavioral shift challenge and a breast milk substitute distribution challenge. And because in the developing world, most countries in the developing world, children are breastfed 2 years, it's also a different longitudinal challenge. And it took about 6 months to realize that, and that was a real failure.
It's been hard.
I wasn't involved at the time, but I understand it was understandably very, very hard.
Yeah. Let's switch gears and go back to your work in the private sector for a little bit, McKinsey and Wall Street. When you were there, did you see the private sector contributing positively to social and environmental issues? Were your employers doing that, or were they sort of on the sideline?
Very much when I was at McKinsey is still is true for McKinsey. McKinsey had a robust social sector practice that engaged with both governments here in the United States, the federal government, as well as local and state governments, and also NGOs around the world. And that was something that I think McKinsey had recognized wasn't only kind of good for its own kind of meta brain, that there were different types of challenges, that people who worked in the social sector kind of got smarter in a particular way that would have applicability to the private sector client base as well. But it also was a recruiting and retention tool because there were people who wanted to have this as part of their portfolio. And I think McKinsey was really ahead of the curve in recognizing that it needed to provide those sorts of opportunities, either as a singular career path or as kind of part of a constellation career path for people who would come and work at McKinsey. And certainly now, from a CGI perspective, we see more and more employers doing that, kind of making kind of CSR not something that is off to the side, but really embedded in how they think about their business model and how they think about recruiting and retaining employees your age, even younger. And so that I find really exciting because I think it's more sustainable for the companies. I think it's going to have a greater impact when kind of a company's CSR programs are more attached to their DNA than kind of just a far-off appendage. And I think it's awesome that young people are driving the choices that businesses are making about not only their kind of what they're producing or making, but their actual business models themselves.
That's great. Let's talk about your book quickly. So you're really busy, but yet you decided to write a book. Tell us more about why you did that and a little bit more about the book.
So I decided to write It's Your World really when I got pregnant. I was thinking about writing It's Your World. I know some of you are like, that's crazy, but that is what happened. I was thinking about writing a book like It's Your World for a while, but then when I knew that I was pregnant, I just felt a different level of responsibility to the world, knowing that I was about to be a mom, if hopefully everything worked out as it did, and I'm so blessed to be my daughter's mother. I had started thinking about writing something kind of targeted to middle school kids about some of the big issues in our country and in our world, particularly those that fall disproportionately hard on kids, like hunger here in the US, or lack of access to education around the world, or the unequal rights for girls everywhere. Because when I was 10 or 11, that's when I started to really think I could make a real difference in the world. By the choices that I was making, by how I was spending my time and energy, and not just by writing letters to President Reagan or then President Bush, as important as I still very much think it is that we all kind of raise our voices kind of in the ballot box and otherwise. I read a book that had a big impact on me called 50 Simple Things Kids Can Do to Save the Earth. And it had such a big impact on me when I was in 5th or 6th grade because it treated me seriously. It didn't talk down to me. It didn't talk to me as just a kid. It treated me seriously as someone who deserved to know, who had to know about climate change and pollution and global warming, and empowered me with really practical suggestions of what I could do as a kid in Little Rock, Arkansas, to make a difference in those areas. You know, it taught me about really how I could work with my school to have a recycling program at my school, or kind of why it was so important to cut up the plastic rings around 6-pack cans of soda, which I did and still do obsessively 20 years later, so that marine wildlife wouldn't choke on them and die. I was horrified to know that I could have carelessly thrown away something in Little Rock that was killing a bird in Louisiana or Alabama. That horrified me. So I wrote It's Your World to help kids have access to kind of what are some of the challenges in our world today, but also to know some of the examples of amazing young and a few older, but really amazing young change makers who are 12, 13, even 6, 7, 15, 16, making a difference in these areas. Because I think we all face an imagination gap. It's hard for all of us to imagine what we can't see. And so I really hope that It's Your World helps just collapse that imagination gap for kids, so that if they do feel called to make a difference, whether it's on clean water or reforestation or helping more kids go to school around the world or standing up to bullies here at home, they have examples of how to do that. And my aspiration is that it'll affect even one kid in the same way that 50 Simple Things affected me, you know, now a long time ago.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, it's a great book for anyone who knows middle schoolers out there.
Well, thank you, Liz.
Yeah. I don't want to talk too much about your mom, but I do want to get your impression on what's going on in Washington these days. It seems to me so messed up that even a wonderful president would have problems making progress and fixing it. So, you know, what's your impression? What is the hope for a future president in D.C.?
Well, I think those are actually lots of different questions, right? I think we have, which is no, but I mean that seriously. I think there are challenges. Right, we have inherent tensions in our government between the executive branch and the legislative branch, in our federal system, between what gets rendered onto the kind of state level versus the local level, the state level versus the federal level. And I actually think we do have amazing bright spots of progress at the local and state level across our country, where mayors, governors, state legislatures are really stepping up and kind of putting a stake in the ground against climate change, putting a stake in the ground for paid maternity leave, putting a stake in the ground for like higher quality education and making sure that education looks like the 21st century and not the 19th century. So we really do have amazing bright spots of progress, and I think that's an important place to start because actually so much of what impacts all of our lives happens at the local or state level. And that's a conversation I have pretty frequently. I mean, I remember when in New York State, we passed equal marriage in 2011. And so, oh, yes. And I was really proud to be part of that effort. And so after we passed equal marriage in New York, I would have people come up to me on the subway and say, like, why can't President Obama just make this happen? Like, well, because it's actually like a legal issue for the states to resolve, right? We either have to go state by state or there has to be a Supreme Court decision, which is what wound up happening. But I realized how the lack of civic education, significantly less than a third of states now have mandatory kind of civic education in the public school system. So we're not teaching kids and young people, like, here's what a mayor generally does, here's what's in a city's power, like recycling. So if you really want recycling, you can hope that maybe the president might do something about that, and I'm sure the Obamas recycle at the White House, but you really need your cities to take leadership on that. And similarly, if you really care about guns at this moment in time, like that effort, like those efforts are really happening at the state level. I mean, often admittedly in full transparency to my horror. I mean, starting next year in Texas, the 50th anniversary of the first mass shooting to occur at an educational institution, the University of Texas, starting next year, on the 50th anniversary of that shooting, people will be allowed to carry weapons now onto college and university campuses in the state system of Texas. So if you know, depending on what you care about, you have to engage meaningfully. Yes, you have to vote, but you also have to make sure that it's on the radar of your legislators or of your city officials, because actually that's where a lot of progress or regression is happening. And then in Washington, I think it's again ensuring that what you care about is on the plates of your legislatures, because really they do listen to their constituents. It's just that often those who shout the loudest get the most traction and attention, but that doesn't mean that the rest of us should still, with civility, kind of raise our hands in greater numbers. And you know, we're going to have an election next year where the entire House of Representatives will be up for election, as happens every 2 years. A third of senators will be up for election, and clearly we have a presidential election, which is probably not news to anyone. And so I just hope that everyone here who is an American citizen make sure that you vote, but also recognizes that kind of democratic participation doesn't only happen in November. Right? It really matters kind of throughout the year, and it also isn't only about who sits in Washington. If we look at local and state election numbers, you know, there's a lot of attention paid on the fact that barely more than 50% of our voters show up to vote on election day in presidential elections. In most state and local elections, it's actually less than a third. So truly, like, this is a denominator challenge. Right? If more people showed up at the polls, and also more people stayed engaged throughout the year, I do fundamentally believe it would change both what was being debated, how it was being debated, and then ultimately what happens in Washington, but also at the state and local level. And please just don't forget how important those conversations actually are.
We're going to take some audience questions if you all want to start lining up at the microphones. As people are lining up at the microphones, Chelsea, I'm sure you've been asked this before, but what about you? Are you going to run for office someday?
So Liz, I have been asked that before. In fact, one of my earliest memories is being a 3-year-old, and my dad was running for governor, because Arkansas actually was the last state in the country to move to 4-year gubernatorial election cycles. So when I was little, my dad was also running every 2 years, just like members of our House of Representatives do. And this woman came up to me, it was at a political rally, I don't admittedly remember where it was, in Arkansas, and she said, "Chelsea, are you going to run for governor of Arkansas one year?"
When you're 3.
And I think I said, "Ma'am, I'm 3." And I was like waving my American flag, because that's what you can do when you're 3, you like wave your American flag. And I think it is an important question that actually all of us ask ourselves. Right? I think clearly there's a strong selection bias in this room. If you didn't care about having an impact, you wouldn't be here today. And I think it's really important that all of us ask, like, whether or not we believe we could have the highest impact that we want to have in the public sector. So it shouldn't just be asked to me because my last name's Clinton. I think it's a question that each of you should be asking yourselves and asking your friends and your colleagues. For me right now, you know, 2 things are true, so the answer is no. I love the work that I do with the Clinton Foundation. I really believe we are making a difference. And I love talking to kids right now about It's Your World and learning more about what they're doing and being a mechanism to help amplify their work in the world. I also live in a city, in a state, and in a country where I support my elected leaders. So if at ever any point, one, and certainly if both of those weren't true, I'd really have to ask myself that question and decide whether or not I thought I was positioned to make a real difference through the public sector. But right now the answer is no. I don't know what the answer will be in the future, but I hope it's an answer that each one of you have for yourselves.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for your comments this morning. They were very inspirational. My name is Bahari Harris. I am a dual MBA, MPP student at Duke University. My question this morning has to do with your smallholder farmer initiative. Can you give us an idea of one or two breakthroughs that the Clinton Global Foundation has had among smallholder farmers and how the foundation has helped to broker those breakthroughs, perhaps through public-private partnerships?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Bahari. I think it's also important, though, underneath your question, is that we often think of innovation as something like bright, new, and shiny. I think particularly in university settings or places like Seattle that are so kind of intimately connected to the new economy and to new knowledge and new products and new services and just new stuff. But often innovations are actually what's worked somewhere else, maybe even for a long time, that have just been sort of contextualized and reimagined in a local environment. And so what do I mean by that? Well, we now do our smallholder work in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Malawi. And so if we think about Malawi, for example, we have more than 55,000 farmers. We are almost at parity of women and men, which is something I'm really proud of. And we have sort of 6 farming cooperatives across the country, and there is an anchor farm that the farmers join. And kind of through their joining, that has a few kind of real tangible meanings pretty quickly. One, they're able to buy higher quality seed at a lower price. 2, they're able to buy higher quality fertilizer at a lower price. But 3, kind of to enable 1 and 2, they have to participate in our technical training. But technical training isn't what you probably think of. Technical training is things like taking a glass Coke bottle, which are pretty ubiquitous products in the developing world, taking a glass Coke bottle, which is about the distance needed between rows of maize. And the depth of a glass Coke bottle is about the depth that you need to dig a hole to put the maize seeds in. And so helping kind of farmers think about how a glass Coke bottle can actually increase their yields along with kind of the higher quality seed and fertilizer, pretty dramatically, right? 50, 60, 70%, right? That's pretty significant. And also teaching people about crop rotation, right? Crop rotation just hadn't really ever been part of the equation before in the places where we're working in Central and East Africa. And so kind of that's what we really mean by innovation. Also putting women in positions of power, even though we're not quite at parity of our farmers, a majority of our farming clubs and anchor farms are run by women. Right, so that's also, I think, an important innovation, even though that may not be thought of in kind of the conventional definition of innovation, and being very open source about what we're doing. So that the Malawian government now, for example, has taken our model and is funding kind of similar efforts in other parts of the country. Right, we think that's real success, right? That the government is saying, yes, like we have seen the greatest kind of economic return. More of the farmers that are in your program are sending their kids to school. They're diversifying their income. They're using that additional income, to buy chickens, to buy cows, to invest in cell phone businesses. And so that's been incredibly exciting that the government is now kind of accompanying our investment. So even more farmers are benefiting from this model. So that's how we think of our model, and that's what we think has been really innovative, and we're really excited about the fact that Tanzania wanted us to bring it to Tanzania, and we're probably going to Kenya next. And we hope to be totally out of Malawi in a couple of years because The farmers are now able to not only run the programs themselves, but increasingly able to expand it and scale it themselves. And that's really even the most exciting.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's take a question over there.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Josie Chand, and I work at the San Francisco Department of the Environment. And my question for you, Chelsea, is each person in this room, we all have privilege, some more than others. How can we use our privilege to create a positive impact for people and our planet?
So Josie, I think there are as many right answers to that question as there are people, right? Because I think we all have a different set of skills, and we have different networks, and we have different experiences. And so I think that we each have to ask ourselves, well, what do we care most about? And for some people, Josie, the answer is not going to be the planet. And that's okay, right? Because for some people, the answer is going to be the planet. And I think that we have to start these conversations asking ourselves and each other, like, what do you care most about, and what are you most passionate about, or what makes you the angriest? Because I think then people are going to have more durable commitment to kind of whatever they're going to do to actually try to solve the answers to those questions. And so if it is the planet, right, I mean, you have a particular set of resources working for the city of San Francisco that someone who works for a company in San Francisco or a nonprofit in San Francisco doesn't have. But the others in those differential settings have other resources. And so I would say try to find even more like-minded people. I think there are particular moments, like with the Paris conference coming up, where there is going to be kind of really thinking about climate change and global warming in the zeitgeist. And so I would just say this is a real moment for people who do care about the planet. But not everyone's going to care about the planet, and that's okay, because other people are going to care about fighting inequality, or helping more girls get engaged in technology and stay in technology, or helping ensure that more people have access to clean water. And that's actually ultimately good for the planet, too. So don't be discouraged if not everyone wants to help the planet, because I'm sure there are lots of people who do. And I think particularly over the next 6 weeks with what's happening at the summit in Paris in early December, you probably have really a particular moment to find even more people who will be partisans than otherwise. And I'm a big believer that in asking those people to do something to help what your ambition would be, and then trying to be responsive to whatever they want to do, whether that's on reforestation or something else altogether. Because again, I guess going back to what I said in response to Liz sharing that embarrassing letter that I sent to President Reagan that had spelling errors in it, is the worst anyone's ever gonna say to you is no. So I would just keep asking, and I bet there are a lot of people here who I hope you go up and find her later if you do care about the planet and if you live in San Francisco, because clearly you should be working together. Thank you.
Back over here, and thank you so far for keeping those questions nice and concise. Let's keep that up.
Hi, a question for you from our friend from Minnesota. What are some of the major initiatives of CGI regarding clean air and clean water initiatives, both here in the States and globally?
So we have like 11 minutes left, and so could spend all of the 11 minutes talking about that, so I'll just answer that very briefly, but hopefully in meaningful ways. Outside the United States, we engage in clean water and clean energy in a few ways. In clean water in particular, we do a lot, yes, around diarrhea, so thank you so much for inadvertently giving me a chance to talk about diarrhea. So through our global health work, we do a lot on both kind of the supply side of trying to solve diarrhea and the demand side of trying to solve diarrhea. So what does that mean? Well, still, more than 750,000 kids die of severe dehydration due to diarrhea around the world every year. I find that completely unconscionable in the 21st century. It wasn't actually that different in New York City in the beginning of the 20th century. Severe dehydration was a major cause of death of children in New York City, and so I imagine also in Seattle, but certainly at least in New York. And we solved that in New York through large-scale public works projects that were actually financed partly by the city and partly privately. Why? Because if kids got sick in the Lower East Side, which in the early 19th century was the early 20th century was the single most densely populated place on Earth. If kids got sick in the Lower East Side, kids got sick on the Upper East Side, right? So the wealthy had a real interest in helping to save the poorest kids in New York City from the things that were making them have diarrhea and making them dehydrated and then causing them to die. Sadly, the way kind of urban patterns are around the world, the wealthy are largely able to insulate themselves, and even the national governments that have a real interest in this just don't have enough kind of capital resources to build clean water and clean sanitation systems at this moment in time. So we can't prevent kids from getting sick from diarrhea, but we really can prevent them from dying. Because even though we have vaccinations against some of the things that make them sick, we don't have vaccinations against most of the things that make them sick. But we can absolutely prevent every child from dying. And yet, still in the developing world, there isn't an awareness that those pretty simple tools exist. And so most mothers still give their kids a gruel-like substance. It differs from India to Malawi to Peru, but it's basically a gruel-like substance because it stops them from having diarrhea, but it doesn't replenish any of their nutrients and it doesn't replenish their hydration levels. And so they need oral rehydration solutions and zinc. And so what we've been doing is having awareness campaigns in the countries where we do a lot of work, like Kenya or Tanzania, Uganda, Malawi, Rwanda, to build real awareness about kind of what is ORS zinc, but also then to assume the purchase price risk of buying it in large quantities so that it doesn't cost $8 per packet, it costs 40 cents per packet so that mothers can really afford it. So that's one example of what we're doing around the world, and then we're also partnering with other kind of efforts like the Procter & Gamble clean water effort with World Vision and others, where they have a different kind of solution to clean water, but one that's particularly useful in water scarce environments like after disaster, kind of we're partners with them. Here in the US, we have just started to get involved in kind of the water debates, not really debates, kind of the water efforts in the West. For example, there's a big kind of water genome effort to really map kind of where there are water resources, what the water tables look like. And we have matched together some of the big data partners with some of the local and state government efforts in the West. There we're not really anything more than an agnostic broker, but we were happy to be able to make some of those connections. So sometimes we're deeply involved in kind of the direct service side and the programmatic side, and sometimes we're more just a matchmaker because we're engaged in so many different aspects of work. So that's just still like a 4-minute answer, but a brief answer.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, Chelsea. It's great to have you here today. It's an honor to be able to be speaking to you right now. My name is Ankita Joshi, and I'm an undergraduate from UC Berkeley studying mechanical engineering.
So hopefully I'll see you at CJU.
Yes, I'm really excited for that. So as I graduate from my undergraduate degree and start my career, I wanted to ask you, what advice would you give to the 20-year-old Chelsea Clinton?
Great question.
I would give my 20-year-old self a few pieces of advice, which I'm sure if I had heard at 20, I wouldn't have been able to take in full candor. But it is still what I would tell myself if I could flash back to when I was a junior at Stanford. So a couple of things. One, I very much kind of fall into the majority statistic that is just so true of young women who are in university and particularly early in their careers of feeling like perfect is the definition of success. Right? And I think perfect is actually the enemy of the good. But I just felt that real pressure, and I know so many of my female friends felt that too when we were at Stanford, kind of early in our careers, in our 20s, of just everything always had to be meticulous. How we looked, what we sounded like, what we did, we had to overperform. And there's a difference between kind of a drive for success and impact and meaning and perfection. And I just wish I'd really understood that. But I don't know if I really would have been able to take that advice. And then sort of the corollary of that is I wish that I'd been just a little more fearless in kind of asking questions more quickly. And I really did learn that through my experience at McKinsey, but it took me a while. Because I really think we all learn by asking questions, but sometimes we need to ask unusual suspects questions, not just the people who are already our professors or our mentors, but people outside of our kind of close ecosystem. And I really learned that now. I learned so much by talking to people who have very different experiences than I do, or working in very different fields than I do. And I just wish I'd understood that a little more quickly too.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
I think we have time for probably one more question over there.
Hi, my name is Santiago Holti. I'm with Senda Athletics, a soccer social enterprise. Hearing you speak about your passion for diarrhea, HIV/AIDS, and clean water remind me of another Bill who started a foundation, along with Melinda. And seeing that you're addressing a lot of similar issues, and the title for this is No I in Team, how do you think foundations and nonprofits can collaborate further in order to make sure that you're putting the people you serve as the priority and not yourself, also thinking that the funding that you're going after counts when you can prove results? So do you think there's models that can help people to collaborate better in foundations and nonprofits? And do you have specific examples that you have done that with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?
So again, a few questions, Santiago. Let me start with our relationship with the Gates Foundation, and then I'll extrapolate out to answer some of your more macro questions. We do a lot of work with the Gates Foundation, and we do a lot of work with the Gates Foundation in kind of two particular areas in global health. The Gates Foundation is the largest private philanthropic funder of global health efforts around the world. They're also, for example, the second largest funder of the World Health Organization. They're the largest funder of Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. And so they are deeply embedded in the global health ecosystem, kind of formally, kind of with these big multilateral organizations, but also in really taking risks for kind of innovative, disruptive efforts, like certainly what we try to do at the Clinton Foundation. And so I think, by definition, anyone who's really involved in global health has to be involved with the Gates Foundation, at least kind of as a knowledge-sharing partner, even if they're not a funder, although they're certainly a funder of the Clinton Foundation. We actually do our No Ceilings work in partnership with the Gates Foundation. No Ceilings, as I mentioned earlier, is our effort around girls and women. And one of our kind of most prominent efforts in the last couple of years was to build the largest data set ever around data related to the rights and opportunities for girls and women across the world. And so we worked with the Gates Foundation closely on that, as well as clearly also closely with some kind of big data analytics firms like Fathom, which spun out of MIT. So I'm a huge believer in working in partnership with those who know more than you do, who have a similar kind of prominent position as you do, but have a different orientation. So I think that's hugely important. Your second question about kind of what can we do to encourage partnership. I mean, at the Clinton Foundation, we only work in partnership. Right? We only work in developing countries where we have a partnership with the government, where we work with the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Agriculture, for example. And we always try to also find private sector partners where we can. For example, the companies that actually manufacture in Nigeria or in Kenya, the ORS zinc packets that then we work to build demand for and build the distribution kind of system for. Because ultimately, again, we want to work ourselves out of a job. Right? That is part of our ethos and even our methodology. Like, what is our exit strategy? And I think that's becoming more common for NGOs and development agencies, even kind of big bilateral development agencies, but it's still not common enough. So I think you're absolutely right that we have to keep kind of that pressure on, because I think really partnership is not only more likely to set you up for success, but also more likely than for part of that success to be your exit so that you can engage and tackle a problem elsewhere. The third thing I would say is that there is some kind of nascent work done around, like, what are some of the kind of non-financial, non-pecuniary incentives that could exist in the nonprofit and social sector space to encourage more merger and acquisition activity. This is a relatively new field, but I think a really exciting one, because we know that there are some areas that are deeply crowded. So for example, in New York City, where I live, there are, even just in Manhattan, more than 90 organizations focused on gay men and HIV/AIDS. Now maybe I think they're 92, registered with the City Department of Health. Now maybe we need all 92, but if we don't, surely there are some economies of scale and effort and then of savings where those savings could be invested in kind of amplifying their mission and actually having a greater impact on the people that they are intending and purposed to serve. So I don't know really what's going to emerge from this new work that IDEO and others are really thinking about. But I think any of us, as you and I clearly do, who care about this space and care about this space being kind of positive disruptors for change and as efficient and as effective as possible, have to pay attention to this work and support what emerges. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for being here. It's been really wonderful to talk with you, and I'm also grateful that now, as a final act, you're going to be recognizing some of our most important
Should I go back to the
people.
podium, maybe?
I think that's a good
Yeah,
idea.
I think so. I think
so Chelsea's going to recognize our chapters of the year.
I felt like I should get back to the podium because it's just more official. So I'm so excited to recognize the chapters of the year. As I'm sure many of, if not all of you know, each year Net Impact selects finalists from a pool of clearly exceptional undergraduate, graduate, professional, and international Net Impact chapters to make their case to be one of the 4 chapters of the year, chapters that have really made a disproportionately positive impact in their community of students and friends and colleagues. So the undergrad chapter is Pennsylvania State University Smeal College of Business. So please give them a round of applause. The graduate chapter is Georgetown University McDonough School of Business. Wow. You really have your own cheering squad.
Congratulations.
Okay, I'm very biased, but this is pretty exciting. The professional chapter is New York City. Congratulations. And the international chapter is the University of Toronto Rotman School of Management. Thank you so much.
I'm going to do a quick picture
Here, I'm going to sneak beside you.
with Chelsea.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, guys. And how about one round of applause for Chelsea Clinton, everyone?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Liz.
Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.